So good morning, everybody. A warm welcome from myself. I'm Guy Boulby from the Department of Transport. I'm head of cycling and walking. Really important topic we're going to be discussing today, which is around ensuring. I'll quickly introduce my speakers who will be joining me on the panel today, and then I'll just make a few introductory remarks. Joining today will be Ersilia Verlinghieri from the University of Westminster, and she'll be followed by Ben Addy from Sustrans, and then Richard Nickson from Transport for Greater Manchester, and our final speaker will be Nick Helps from Bath and North East Somerset Council. So the purpose of this webinar is to explore some of the issues and discuss how to address some of the key concerns and risings that have been raised on active travel schemes in the past sort of 6 months or so. In particular, we'll be talking about how we manage concerns around congestion, around the effect on businesses and residents, and talking about the right process, the most appropriate way to consult local businesses and residents and gain public support on the schemes. So part of the discussion we'll be looking at some evidence and case studies from around the country to give people a bit of an insight into what has worked elsewhere and how it might translate to the sort of projects that you may be involved in your local authorities or the local authorities that you support. So in terms of DfT's position on active travel schemes and how we consult and what our priorities are, I just want to start by saying that ministers here in DfT and across government are absolutely committed to the commitments in the Prime Minister's plan, which was published in July 2020. This is really a step change in how we see cycling and walking and how it fits into our green restart coming out of the COVID-19 crisis. It's really important that local opposition to these schemes doesn't undermine our long-term programme. So we do have a grand vision. So by 2030, we want to make half of all journeys in towns and cities to be cycled or walked. That's quite a big increase from today. And if we do that, if we're going to achieve that in the next 10 years, then we do need the initial schemes to go off on the right foot and to be accepted and have obvious benefits to communities. We've also had to assure ministers that the Tranche 2 schemes that we've been supporting under the Active Travel Fund will have appropriate consultation and will be amended in light of the evidence that is returned and collected on those schemes. So it's on this basis that ministers agreed to the Tranche 2 of the funding, following what I think has been quite a testing time on Tranche 1 schemes. I mean, on that, I'd just like to, for all local authorities and all involved in Tranche 1 schemes, I'd like to thank you for your commitment to get those schemes out in what has been a very difficult and challenging time for everybody in government and local government and business. And those schemes are starting to make a really big difference to those who live in and around them. I'd also sort of point out that a lot of the media backlash and apparent public backlash on some of these schemes has really been focused on a very small number and by a minority of stakeholders. That's not to say that there aren't things that we can learn from our Tranche 1 experience. I mean, we encouraged local authorities to roll out these schemes as fast as we could because we had a real crisis looming. And that crisis looming was that the social distancing on public transport systems, particularly buses, there's a real capacity issue, and we need to get key workers and support other essential journeys when actually capacity was sometimes down by 80 or more %. So reallocating road space to cycling and walking was an essential way to meet this challenge and avoid people jumping in their cars and causing too much congestion. As we go into Tranche 2, I mean, the first thing I'd say about Tranche 2 is that we no longer call it the Emergency Active Travel Fund. It's simply the Active Travel Fund. And the schemes that we're seeing built in Tranche 2 will be less reactive to the COVID crisis and more about starting to build out the long-term cycling and walking networks that have been long planned and developed within local cycling and walking infrastructure plans that many authorities and mayoral combined authorities have been putting together. However, we do want to get a sensible balance of delivery and consultation. So there are a number of requirements that we put on local authorities as part of Tranche 2 schemes, which I'll just quickly reference before we go into panel speakers. The first is that we want authorities to be as transparent as possible with all stakeholders about how they will consult on these schemes. So they have been asked to put consultation plans on websites within the next few weeks so that people can see when and how local authorities will be engaging on their schemes. Secondly, we've asked local authorities to undertake appropriate public opinion surveys in their areas. So we in DfT published a national survey on the 13th of November, undertaken for us by Kantar, which showed that actually there is, a big support, there's majority of support for schemes that reallocate road space to cycling and walking. In fact, 2/3 of over 2,000 respondees across the country said they were highly supportive or supportive of these schemes. And around 80% of people want to see a reduction in traffic in their local roads and local neighbourhoods. So we do know that support is very high. That's not to say that we can discount some of the worries and concerns of some stakeholders. So it's important that these surveys go beyond just residents and look at other stakeholders that have potential concerns about the schemes. So that would include local businesses who can be worried about loss of revenue that might become apparent from the schemes. Often these worries are ill-founded, but they do need to be engaged and they need to see some of the mitigation actions. The emergency services are key, bus operators, raw mail deliveries, the views of local MPs and ward councillors, and to engage disabled person groups to ensure that we aren't inadvertently making it more challenging rather than easier for disabled people to get around. The third requirement we put on authorities was that the consultation, appropriate levels of consultation, should complete before schemes start to be built out. And that's something we'll be looking for confirmation from authorities before major schemes are rolled out, that actually consultation has happened, that the feedback from those consultations has been taken into account in scheme design and rollout where it's appropriate. So clearly this is not about making everybody happy. This is about getting the appropriate balance for all road users and ensuring that the benefits for cycling and walking are not outweighed by the disbenefits for other road users. And finally, we'll be asking local authorities to monitor and evaluate their schemes to ensure that they are learning from operation of the schemes and are making the right adjustments in the light of learnings. So that's the end of my introductory remarks on this. I'll be introducing my first panel speaker in a minute, but before I do so, if you have questions that are apparent as we go through the slides and the presentations, can you please put them in the chat box, and we'll be collating those questions and we'll put them back to the panel members. I guess I'll be answering some myself at the end. There'll be a Q&A that follows of around 40 minutes, depending on the length of the presentations. So that's it in terms of introductory remarks. I'll just hand over to our first speaker, who will be Ersilia. So over to you, Ersilia.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invite and the initiative. As you might know, we recently published a report that proposes an equity analysis of the LTNs in London that is available on the website. In this presentation, I want to go a bit beyond the technicalities of the report and give some more space to the broader picture, resonating a bit with what Guy just said. And I'm very happy to go back to our evidence in the Q&A, talking a bit more about the support around congestion and other issues that have been arised around LTNs. And one reason I think why the broader picture is so important is because I think we are now at a state in which we need to rediscuss in depth what should be our fundamental objective as planners and policymakers. I believe we are now a moral imperative to stop car-centered planning. We have to pull the brake of an invention that is causing too many health, social and environmental issues in our societies. We need to prepare for a fundamental change in the way our cities and transport systems are planned and function. In this situation, more space dedicated to other forms of mobility and society, as LTNs are now a must. So, if we begin with this assumption, then the question I want to address in this presentation is how, in the midst of a global pandemic, can we best promote this change? And how can changes in our urban designs, like new bike lanes or new LTNs, help us in this direction? Can you go to the next slide, please? To answer this question, I'm going to take you briefly to Vancouver. In the slide, you can see a 2012 map of the city. In green, you can see the current bike lanes, and in the red box, the Barrett Street Bridge, one of the arteries to downtown, with a bike lane on it. Back in 1996, the bridge had 4 lanes for cars, 2 pavements, but not cycleways. In that year, the local council launched a pilot project aimed at transforming 2 of the car lanes into cycleways. The new cycle lane lasted only 7 days and ended up in political hostility, becoming also a key reason why the mayor lost the subsequent elections. 13 years later, the opposite political party went back to the project and not only managed to implement it with a few critical changes in the design, but turned the bike lane in a public success, despite strong and polarized views still existed about the project. What was the key of this success? A carefully crafted combination of 1. Good communication, 2. Appropriate design, 3. Good political strategy and leadership, 4. Institutional learning from the previous failure, and 5. Strong engagement processes. Enough resources were invested in carefully designing the intervention, in assessing all its potential impacts, and in appropriately involving all the actors that could be affected, but also in communicating carefully and making sure that the media didn't have a strong story of anger or conflicts to portray, but instead one talking about environment and health. It is clear to all of us that bringing about even small changes in our urban infrastructure mobilizes a very complex world of beliefs, values, practices that we have to carefully take into account at any stage of implementation. This to understand both why and how changes generate intense reactions, as well as to ensure that transition to low-carbon transport systems are fully just and equitable. And to do this, I think it is crucial to understand the complex array of factors that make car dependency so strong and so hard to tackle. Next slide, please. In the past 60 years, we have collectively invested a wealth of resources in solidifying a system in which technologies, infrastructure, economies and policies, as well as ideas around freedom, perception of comfort and safety all come together to make the car the answer to many of the needs and problems that we have. This system, that in academia we call automobility, is incredibly strong and plays a key role in our economies, societies and imaginaries. It is reinforced every day by adverse, more technologies and more investments. It is then clear that in a moment of enormous economic crisis such as a pandemic, when many other certainties are dismantled and when fear is so high, the protection of the right to the car becomes a main stage of conflict. This especially when, for many, more than being a rational choice, the car has been the only option to access livelihoods, healthcare and education. It has also been the only option that felt reliable, safe or accessible, even if sometimes maintaining a car costs a big part of someone's income. Moving by car has never fully been a free individual choice, and we have to understand that it's not at the level of individual behavior that change can happen. And I think this is a crucial point, and it is here that interventions like LTNs can have much power and bring some hope. Next slide, please. First of all, because with a minimal change in the urban infrastructure and design, they propose a key shift in the meaning around what mobility is about, a shift that responds directly to the core assumption of car dependency. LTNs uncover how mobility are not an individual solitary choice, but co-produced, interlinked, part of a complex system of infrastructures, meanings and practices. LTN shift walking and cycling from being an individual daily struggle in a world designed around cars to being a practice facilitated and enabled by others and the environment around us. In this, they are also key because they give a different meaning to what public space is for, transforming it from being an empty container that facilitates individualized flow from A to B to a place where sociality and connection happen, a place to reimagining different rhythms and ways to live our cities. And this is why LTNs can be so successful. And this is also why we can get so passionate about them or so voraciously oppose them. And this is why they need to be supported not just with the minimal effort to implement some boulders, but we need to accompany them with resources to highlight the good story that they create, to allow people to experiment and try them, to let them feel safe to walk and cycle, and to make sure that we can support this change also at the level of the meanings and values. Next slide, please. So if we go back to the Vancouver example, I think the key messages are that LTN can be successful, but we have to take into account a few points. One, that design and planning are crucial. It is not just the design of one junction or one planter. It is making possible that LTNs become part of an integrated network of walkways and cycleways where people feel safe to move and where they are reliable and easy to access alternative to the car for everyone. This means that we can stop dividing the city between cyclists, pedestrians, and drivers, and have a functioning network that allows us to access things that we value in the best way for us and the others. Studies on Barcelona superblocks show that residents outside the blocks had complaints, but those had been responding with synchronizing the implementation of more of the blocks, creating a network of active travel corridors where moving feels safe and there is a real alternative to the car. Two, that design and planning are so crucial because those changes can have unintended consequences. We need to make sure that these consequences don't affect people who already have to cope with higher deprivation, lack of resources, or higher air pollution. Those are the ones that have to be better off instead. Our study shows that the distribution of new LTNs in London is fairly equitable, and this is a great success. But is this going to be the case after so many have been dismantled? We need to assess the social impacts of these schemes as they go in and make sure that complementary measures are in place to contain any potential negative effect. Third, another thing that the case of Vancouver taught us is that narratives around by the media play a key role in making these changes successful. Why? Because emotion play a big role in this story. We have to show that after anger in Waltham Forest, residents started loving their mini Hollands. And the recent surveys show that more than 50% of Londoners support these interventions. And to tell us that if we were a bit more patient after perhaps some chaos in the first period, these changes can really bring key benefits. And I think in this, actions like Sarah Berry's signs or start renaming this intervention as active travel neighborhoods can really help. We need also resources in helping developing those competencies and knowledges that people need to moving outside the car. And finally, it is crucial to have a properly designed engagement processes. Local authorities need the resources and the opportunity to deliver solid engagement processes everywhere and not just where people have requested a change already. We need resources to build a process that is informed by an idea of procedural justice. We need to make sure that it's not just a vocal minority that is pushing one or the other way. We need a process that accounts for the needs of the ones that don't feel safe to walk around, for the needs of the ones who deserve a space to play without risking their lives due to pollution or accidents, for the needs of those who spend too much of their income to maintaining a car because it is a necessity, and for many of the others that too often get forgotten in our planning processes, or for whom we speak without having firstly listened. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ersilia. So a great way to sort of kick off the discussion here at a fairly strategic level. So now I'm going to invite Ben Addy from Sustrans. Ben has an array of different images to show you. So I'm intrigued to see how you're going to get through all of it in 10 minutes, but over to Ben.
Hi, yes, my name's Ben Addy. I'm the head of collaborative design at Sustrans in London. I think I've negotiated 11 minutes, so we'll have to see how we get on, but it is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Next slide, please. Obviously we've got a whole room, a virtual room of experts here, but I think it's just really helpful to sort of take it back a little bit to think about what is community engagement and what do we mean by it, particularly in reference to consultation. So for me, community engagement happens before and during the delivery of a scheme, including a trial stage. And then a formal consultation happens at the end of that trial. So essentially, community engagement from the outset, consultation towards the end. And I think it's really important to remember that community engagement isn't simply communications, but that communications is a really important part of a wider community engagement program. Next. So as a starting point, I think it's, and as others have mentioned, it's really important to think about who we're talking to. So on every scheme I've ever worked on, there's people who really love it and there's people who really don't like it. And those people have, they're very loud, there's lots of energy, it can easily take up the vast majority of your time and resource. But it's important to remember that those numbers are relatively few and they're also very unlikely to change their minds. And so in the middle, you've got this kind of 50, 60, 70, 80% of people who maybe are disenfranchised, who seldom heard voices, are too busy, or just have never thought about the street in those terms. And that's where we need to be focusing our time and resource. Next. So what is it? So for me, there's three clear reasons why community engagement is important to the delivery of active travel fund schemes and schemes in the public realm in general. Next. The first is that engagement will help you deliver greater equity. By bringing in those seldom heard voices, we're going to ensure that schemes are better understood, that they're being delivered in the places that need them the most. And our streets and spaces aren't equitable at the moment. People are treated differently in them. People feel safe or unsafe in them. And engagement will really help draw out those stories. Next slide. It gives you the greatest chance of delivering ambition. So you can take people on a journey. At moments of where a scheme might be kind of pared back and people are concerned, you're able to encourage people to think bigger, to be more ambitious. And it allows you to kind of have those conversations which just simply wouldn't be taking place otherwise. Next slide. And finally, it allows you to better manage risk. If you're part of that conversation, if you know the community leaders, if you're embedded in those neighborhoods, you're able to manage those conversations as they come up, because as soon as you kind of lose control of that and you're chasing the conversation or chasing the narrative, it's really, really hard to catch up with it. Next slide. So for me, there's some real key principles to meaningful engagement, and I'm just going to run through those very quickly and then talk about some of the more kind of practical side of it. Next slide. So I think it's really important to start from this point that, with the exception of perhaps a few outliers, nobody wants a dangerous street. And so often in these consultations, in the conversations that we've had, even in tranche one, you've got people sort of saying, you don't care about my kids, and then you've got other people saying, you don't care about my business. But if we start from this point, nobody wants a dangerous street. Yes, there might be a whole variety of different ways that people think you go about ameliorating that. But if you're starting from that point, you can then have a meaningful conversation around how you might be able to reimagine it to be a better place. Next slide. And you need to start your engagement as early as possible. It goes back to that point about not wanting to chase the conversation. You need to be there at the outset. Next. It has to be flexible. So, one size doesn't fit all. It very much, you can't just sort of roll out this blanket approach. It very much depends on the local context around the actual sort of issues and challenges, the communities, what you're trying to achieve, and then you develop a program that responds directly to that. Next. You need to, then this is, vitally important, you need to go to people. You can't expect them to come to you. The people at either end of those spectrum, they're going to come to you. They're going to be filling out your online survey. They're going to be coming to your scheduled drop-in session in the local church hall. But you need to go to the broader swathe of the local population. You need to go to those democratic spaces like outside the school gate, at the bus stop, at the train station, in the parade of shops, and understand what people's needs are. Next. And it really helps to take an issue-led approach, as opposed to sort of going in and telling people that it's their lucky day. Look, you've got this project, but actually being able to take an issue-led to understand what issues are held within that community and how your project can kind of answer to them. Next. And good data is absolutely essential, not just the sort of how many people are cycling, how many cars are going through here and how fast, but as much data as you can collect about that place, so that you're able to explain to people, this is why the project's happening here. This is why it's a good thing this project's happening. And that data can't be an obscure spreadsheet or a really hard to read graph. It needs to be accessible. And the digital revolution is wonderful for engagement. It's made my job a lot easier, but it is just a tool, and we can't simply rely on digital platforms. They're one part of the solution, but we've got to get onto the street. We've got to get talking to people, having those conversations. Next slide. And again, I keep emphasizing this, but it's not about the loudest voices. It's not just about those two ends of the spectrum. We've got to be having conversations with a much broader swathe of people, particularly the people who suffer the most from some of the things that we're trying to resolve. Next slide. And we need to engage holistically. Not everybody is going to be jumping for joy that cycling might be easier, or even walking might be easier. But by referring, for example, to Lucy Saunders' Healthy Streets indicators, we need to shape the engagement around all of these different things, all of the different elements that make up a good space or a functioning street. Next slide. And so, how does engaging on active travel fund schemes differ? So we've heard. The time frames are a little bit tighter, and perhaps the scope is a little more tightly defined, both geographically in terms of, the shape of LTNs and possibly some of the outcomes. And obviously after the first round, we did see some politicization of schemes around that were being delivered. But that doesn't mean you can't engage meaningfully, and it doesn't mean that the principles that we've just talked about don't apply. Again, it kind of goes to that point about one size doesn't fit all, and we have to develop our engagement approach that meets the requirements of the Active Travel Fund. Next slide. So what does meaningful engagement look like in practice? And this isn't, I'm not covering everything here, and it's very quick, and there's so much more you can do, but these are just some of the kind of key deliverables that we do in our work and that I think are important. So councillor engagement obviously is absolutely vital. They have the power to empower a scheme, and they have the power to sort of end a scheme. And they're also at the forefront. They're going to be they're going to come under a lot of pressure from their constituents. They need to have the information to hand. They need to be supported. They need to be part of the team. Communications, obviously this is a very broad catch-all. It covers everything from digital to flyers through the door to engagement boards up in neighbourhoods. But the key with this is that it has to be accessible. The information has to be up to date, and it has to be a two-way conversation. It's not just about us giving out information. It's about having a dialogue with people. So that could be filling out something online, or it could be taking a board marker and writing on a board in the neighbourhood. Next slide. And stakeholder engagement. So not just your kind of the stakeholders that come very quickly to mind, but those that you've got to work a little bit harder, those whose voices aren't typically heard. And these will be your champions. These you'll be able to access their networks. They're going to be the people that really help propel your scheme forward. Next slide. And face-to-face engagement, as I've mentioned, is vital. And this is your scheduled event that is promoted, and where you will get often some of the the usual suspects attending, but then also getting out in those democratic spaces, as I mentioned, outside the school gate, doing walkabouts with kids, involving kids in the decision making. It's children have such brilliant ideas and are very disproportionately impacted by poor street design. So get them out, pop-ups in those democratic spaces. Talk to that broad swathe of people about what their issues are and what the opportunities are. Next slide. And one-to-one engagement is really important, perhaps with more vulnerable members of a neighbourhood or an area, but also getting on the phone and having one-to-one conversations with people, can really help. Next slide. And business engagement, as we've heard, different people use the spaces in different ways. There's all sorts of different perceptions around how, for example, customers want a space to be or how they use it. And getting businesses involved is key. And again, it goes to that point about nobody wants a dangerous street. So how do we go about making it better? Next slide. And behavior change. And we've heard about this too. So it's not just about a camera or a bollard in the street. It's about how we make our streets social spaces, democratic spaces. And they need to be activated. And this should be happening during the engagement, during the consultation of a project. So people can understand that, the street can be about so much more. In London, 80% of our public space are streets. We need to be using them in dramatically different ways. And by empowering people, especially communities who might have trouble accessing bikes or for whom the street is perceived as an unsafe space, we need to be running activities to allow them to realize that it can be used for something different. Next slide. And trials, obviously, very important. This gives people the chance, to see what something might be like, to see how it works. And we need to engage during those trials because, there's often a trial isn't going to be perfect. So we might need to make changes, and that helps you build trust. It's kind of that you said, look what we've done now. We're making these changes because of how you fed back, and continuing that dialogue through that process. Next slide. And obviously COVID has changed things, to a certain extent, but that doesn't mean we can't engage meaningfully. And who knows what the next few months are going to look like. And who knows, we've got different tiers and there's, complexities around this. And the important thing is that we ensure that everybody's safe and we're being responsible, but it is still possible to engage. Outside events, socially distanced events, using digital platforms, using the telephone, one-to-ones, or going for socially distanced walks around neighborhoods. It is still possible to deliver meaningful engagement during COVID. You just have to think about it. And again, it goes back to that, there's no one size fits all. Next slide. Yeah, that's it. That's it from me. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ben. Very interesting set of pragmatic challenges and issues. I'm very impressed that you managed to get through what was quite a comprehensive content in that time. But I can see quite a few interesting takeaways on that already. So please keep the questions coming in the questions box, and we'll collate and return to those after the presentations are finished. So I can now invite Richard Nickson from TFGM.
Thank you, Guy, and good morning, colleagues. I'm sure, like many of you, this year has been probably one of the most challenging we've ever experienced in the sector, and it continues to cause us numerous challenges. But I think, as Ben has said, it also presents us opportunities to consider how we engage and achieve community buy-in. In Greater Manchester, we were rather lucky, I think it's fair to say, that for the last 3 years, we've been on a journey of how to engage and build successful community engagement in walking and cycling and active travel behaviour change. We obviously have the benefit of leadership in the Mayor, Andy Burnham, and also the collective leadership of the combined authorities, the leaders and chief executives of the local authorities, who've very much, for want of a better word, risen to the challenge that this year has presented to them, but also prior to that, the work that we put in to engage with the communities of Greater Manchester on the formation of the B network and the Made to Move report. So with the Commission's support and backing, we've formed a vision over those last 3 years. We've got a very substantial proposal for a network for active travel, and we've also got our Made to Move steps for success, which help refine the kind of behaviour change, policy and other actions that we need to take. So next slide, please. So as Ben's indicated, this might be the traditional perception of engagement, and this is, for example, one of our active neighbourhood consultations pre-COVID, standing room only, fantastic engagement. But the big challenge for us obviously is how do we continue to do that in the COVID period? And that's been a massive challenge to us. But the key thing there is to create and empower a sense of place for our communities. And the districts in Greater Manchester have been exploring all sorts of imaginative and creative ways of doing that. working closely with partners like Sustrans and members of the Walking and Cycling Alliance, and also our local campaign group, Walk Ride GM. So we have multiple channels of engagement and multiple opportunities to do that. And I think the key thing has been maintaining that conversation, building the impetus that we've gained around the B network, and this year in particular, exploring mechanisms by which we can go ahead and make the progress that we all so much need to do. So what is that vision? In Greater Manchester, it principally fits around the concept of our network. We want cleaner air, we want to manage and reduce congestion, we want to introduce a range of accessible and affordable transport measures, including active travel, and we want a healthy and active population. So once, you know, we're trying to build a great place to grow up, get old, and move on and grow on. Now, responding to COVID has been obviously a massive challenge. Next slide, please. So this is a typical example of a street scene that we have throughout Greater Manchester. This is the Northern Quarter in Manchester. And the big challenge we face for active travel, of course, and place at the moment and throughout the history so far has been that 80% of the space is given over to motor traffic. But this actually sits at the heart of our B network through Manchester City Centre. And during COVID, one of the things that we introduced was the opportunity to provide safer streets to save lives, because we needed to build into our infrastructure the space in which people could continue to go about their business and their daily lives, but could do it in a safe and managed way. Next slide, please. So we took the opportunity, and Manchester City Council took the opportunity here to implement effectively that dramatic road space changes that were needed, funded by the action we took under Safer Streets Save Lives at a local level prior to the Emergency Active Travel Funds becoming available. So that gave us a good example of the kind of pop-up measures we could begin to explore to preserve pedestrian and also cycle space at the time. And it was very welcome, therefore, then that the Emergency Active Travel Fund came along, and we could then continue to explore that. So the B network, as colleagues will know, has currently around about 80 to 90 active schemes on the book, and the Emergency Active Travel Fund has now allowed us to expand that to well over 100. And it's a combination of measures that are both temporary, semi-permanent, permanent, and which complement each other across that whole network plan. Next slide, please. And so within Greater Manchester, like many areas, we saw a huge drop-off, obviously, at the start of lockdown in general traffic. But what we did see was growing use of active travel. So the other thing that we did throughout the period of this summer and into the autumn was survey people's intent, experiences, and hope for how they may move forward to travel next year. But one of the key things that we attempted to do in the response to COVID, and picking up again on Ben's point, was engage that behaviour change immediately and embrace the fact that there was a need to change travel behaviours. There was virtually no patronage on bus, virtually no patronage on mass transit systems, and obviously much less traffic on the roads generally. But key workers still needed to get to destinations. So we were able to act rapidly, for example, to deploy somewhere around 500 bikes to key workers in the health sector. And now we're seeing the fruits of that in the continued demand for walking and cycling by key workers, and an increased demand for secure end destination parking, for example. So we were able to support that change in an active way. Next slide, please. We were able to also survey our population in Greater Manchester, and actually what we found is that people found that experience positive, so positive attitudes towards walking and cycling, that they found that it could be safer to do that if we managed to introduce changes to road spaces, and that many of them claim that they intend to do that more often. And we are continuing to see that intent to cycle and walk more in Greater Manchester. And obviously that's very welcome and something we're looking to take forward as we develop our B network and active travel schemes. But of course, consultation is really challenging in this current environment. So prior to lockdown, we did have a good digital estate. So we had various mechanisms for mapping the B network. And we also had a platform, GM Consult, that we were using to engage with the broader community of GM on issues such as clean air, bus reform, the the city centre transport strategy, and also active travel. So the communities could see the purpose of what we were doing in the round. Next slide, please. But the Active Travel Fund has enabled us to do exactly what Ben said, which is to experiment and implement trials, experiments on a temporary basis to engage communities in a way which we perhaps wouldn't traditionally already do. You know, we'd go down the normal traditional route of consulting on temporary traffic orders and then moving through the process of a design in a linear way. Next slide, please. But we took the opportunity quite boldly to reallocate road space. This was one of our biggest examples, approximately 8 kilometres of route from Trafford into the city centre and also from Salford into the city centre. And I think, as Ben indicated, we actually continued to make changes to those, and it's a commendation to the districts that they were able to be fleet of foot, to modify schemes to respond to changing traffic issues. For example, the A56 scheme, we did have to modify that to deal with issues around congestion and bus issues, but we were able to do that in a way that now we're looking to, with Trafford District, to move forward on consolidating that scheme into a semi-permanent and even permanent scheme, which dramatically enhances access from that particular borough into the city centre. And if we look at the next slide, we can see that in detail, whereas the overall moving average of cycling and walking has tended to grow steadily but show the usual peaks and troughs, what we've seen on the A56 has been a dramatic and significantly higher level of increase. So we do know that if we provide that space, people will come, for want of a better word. And I think the way in which we're now moving towards examining how we support people's engagement with the process are things such as virtual rooms. So trying to recreate that consultation environment that we're all familiar with in the virtual world, using augmented reality, using VR, continuing to use those web portal platforms, telephone surveys, leaflets, mapping tools, etc., that people can interact with. Telephone surveys particularly has been an extremely useful way of engaging with those, obviously, who can't participate in face-to-face activities at the moment. So we've recently carried out a very substantial telephone survey to support our bike hire scheme, which we hope to launch in the new year. And that obviously has been a good opportunity for us to explore different ways of data collecting and engaging with a broad audience. Next slide, please. And as I say, going back to this question of leadership, some really quick decisions are having to be taken at this moment in time. Really fast-moving decisions, particularly because of the timescales associated with active travel funds. And it's been extremely important to have the support and backing of the community in demonstrating the willingness to receive these changes. And we continue to push hard on that, and we attempt to strive towards high quality as well, both in our permanent and temporary schemes, to ensure that what we do has a meaningful change. And if schemes aren't working, be prepared to stop them or change them, because otherwise it brings into disrepute the activity of what you're actually attempting to do. Next slide, please. And finally, thanking the community for what they've done. So particularly under our Safe Streets, Save Lives banner, we actually attempted to encourage people to think about the purpose of what they were doing, which was taking pressure off, for example, public transport networks, and trying to communicate to people that it wasn't just about the bike or just about people being on foot. It was actually about their wider contribution to society and coping with COVID. And we've continued to use TDM type approaches to communicate that, to encourage people to transfer from mode, to take pressure off different bits of the system. And that's something which we continue to do and we continue to explore. And I think that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. So a very interesting summary of some of the challenges and statistics of things happening in Manchester. I'm sure we'll want to get under the skin of some of the challenges a bit later on in the Q&A. So let's introduce our last speaker today, who is Nick Helps from the Bath and North East Somerset Council. Nick.
Great, thank you, Guy. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to speak about the consultation that we have undertaken as part of developing our Liverpool neighbourhoods. Next slide, please. So really showing why we're doing this. We often have to remind people that this started with the climate and ecological emergency, which the council has declared. And this feeds into our corporate strategy, but also we have a health and wellbeing strategy, and Clean Air Zone for Bath is going live in March next year, when we have a Class C Clean Air Zone. So our livable neighbourhoods are, we've split into the work into three strands. So low traffic neighbourhoods, residence parking, and electric vehicle charging. Now the reason why we put these together is because all these developments are going to be on the street at a similar time. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So we produced a consultation brochure which set out the types of measures we were proposing, and then detailed strategies on our website. And this is not just about, we're trying to remind people it's not just about closing rat runs, but also about a wholesale modal shift. And some of the changes residents themselves will need to make the livable neighbourhoods successful, including a huge cut in car van mileage and a big shift away from petrol and diesel. Next slide, please. One of our key elements of a core strategy is that we'll give people a bigger say in shaping our services. So we've embraced this with our livable neighbourhoods and developed a process of how we're going to put the schemes on the street. Using co-design is going to be a strong element. We want the community to be involved. And if you go to our website and look at our livable neighbourhoods strategy, you'll see a more detailed flow chart of how this process is going to work. We were lucky to have Councillor Clyde Lokes from Waltham Forest Council come and give a presentation in January. And because of COVID, we had a couple of, we couldn't have public meetings, but we had public webinars. A consultation where we had the strategies available for viewing and a 50-question SurveyMonkey survey, and with about 1,600 responses. And I'm going to go on to show some of the results. Next slide, please. So these are stacked bars showing the results of the key principles elements of our livable neighbourhood strategies and the questions we asked. So the green colours relate to support, agree and strongly agreeing with the question, and the red pink areas are the disagree, and the no opinion in the yellow. So this is using a sort of Likert style questionnaire, and then the support and disagree are summarised in the numbers at the either end of the bars. The Kantar results that some of you may have seen use a similar methodology. And you'll see that massive support for reducing the dominance of vehicles, agreeing that there's a great potential to encourage active travel, and that space should be reclaimed for the public realm. Next slide, please. Still huge support for restricting through traffic, and this will also affect residents as well. And there'll be trade-offs. There will be, does mean that some residents will have to take some longer journeys to get to some of the main roads. But again, huge support for the measures. And we've heard talk of loud voices, and of course at other ends of the spectrum, some people wanted us to do more, and some are very concerned about these proposals. Next slide, please. So looking at some of the priorities, we split the consultation into principles and priorities, and looking at the priorities, we asked about improving air quality. and the general health of the public, and as part of reducing chronic disease. And again, massive support from the respondents that these are the sorts of measures they want to see implemented on their streets. It was across Bath, North East Somerset, but the majority of respondents were from Bath. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
I think we might be losing you, Nick.
Sorry, have we lost my audio?
No, you're okay now.
Okay, next slide, please.
I think it might be just my colleague having internet problems, so just bear with us a second, Nick.
Okay. Until I wait for the next slide, I can just maybe make a comment about the comparison between some of these results and the work that Department for Transport published by Kantar, and our support is showing stronger levels of support than the Kantar study, possibly because a lot of the respondents live in Bath and they see more urgent requirement for action. When you compare the Kantar work was looking at towns and cities, the element was towns and cities. So if you take a location like Bath, where there is a stronger desire for change, I think you will. This is why we're seeing stronger levels of support. Are we able to bring the slide back?
Don't worry, Nick. Just apologies for this, everybody. We're having a few internet problems in the background, so we'll be back up and running in a few seconds. So just give us a second while we change over.
I can mention I can go on actually and talk about some of the concerns that were expressed.
Yeah, that would be fine. We'll be back up with the slides as soon as we possibly can. So bear in mind we're working on it. Okay.
Until the next slide comes. Oh, this is I think we've had these ones. Yes, we've had those too. But I can mention some of the concerns that were raised. Oh, here's another one. Okay, that's fine, yes. So again, huge support for encouraging walking, cycling, about how we might be able to increase footfall at shops, cafes and businesses, and how these businesses we think will thrive. I think there's evidence from Waltham Forest, for example, in Oxford Road, how businesses are, there's a rejuvenation in business in some of the streets. Next slide, please. So we're suggesting some of the measures and introducing the concept of modal filters to the public, and strong support again. There's some concern about Bath being a World Heritage Site and how the measures might detract from World Heritage status, but people generally felt the measures could be accommodated. And on-street parking, this is where the residence parking scheme comes in. There was strong support for restricting parking, prioritising residents, and eliminating commuters from residential areas. Next slide, please. So there were obviously quite a lot of concerns expressed, possibly from the minority looking at that level of support, but these concerns are real, so we can talk about them. Taking the working from the top left, people were concerned that disabled people would be disadvantaged. They're using their cars more. Older people would be disadvantaged. Didn't you know that Bath was in the valley of the River Avon, and there are steep gradients, topography issues? Isn't that a problem for walking and cycling? Also, concern about how families with young children, which currently heavily dependent on cars for many travel purposes, and low-income groups, how would they? Is it right that they should be charged for residence parking permits? And with the introduction of more electric vehicle on-street charging, that will therefore reduce the amount of parking space, and will I be able to park my car, for instance? And worries about decanting traffic. That's why I'm showing a beaker, congestion on main roads, and overall levels of parking. So all these concerns are valid and real, which we'll address. Next slide, please. So people are also very enthusiastic. They really like the concept of co-design. In fact, they wanted us to be, this is working clock rides around the hexagons, they wanted us to be more ambitious. They saw that there was a huge scope for increasing cycling. And schools, they felt that a huge increase potentially for walking to school and great use of public transport, and many people embracing the idea that electric vehicles would be, and there would be on-street charging. Next slide, please. We had a mixed media response. The main excellent photo there of Councillor Loke from Waltham Forest with one of our joint cabinet members for transport, and the event we held. The Somerset Live article, little less, not quite as clear and supportive, and some online newspapers talking about fact checking, cherry picking. Unfortunately, it depends who does the fact checking. In this case, it was possibly a campaign group that was against livable neighbourhoods. Next slide, please. So some of the learning points. I think with this consultation, you have to be clear with dealing with people's hopes and fears. And it's not just like counting traffic or asking where people are going. So you do have to be really careful of loaded questions. And the best way to do that is really to get market research advice and ensure this work is done professionally and to a standard where it can be robust. And trying to get responses from all age groups. We had particularly high level of response from older people, so we need to make sure that all age groups are involved, and individual groups such as disabled people and other people with special needs need to seek out those views, because you can't just rely on pure public consultation to secure that. Next slide, please. Great, thank you for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Nick. So that completes our sort of set piece presentations this morning. We'll now move into some Q&A. So the way we'll manage this is we've been looking at all the questions that have been asked in the chat, and we're putting those to panel members, probably in batches, so that we can get through as many as possible. But apologies if we don't specifically answer your particular question. I'll just start off just by responding to a couple of questions that were directed at me, so at Department for Transport, and then we'll move into some of the more general questions. So Penny Gill asked about balancing benefits for all road users, when we know actually there are some disbenefits for some particular road users, and what our position was on that. Well, we totally understand that. We know that it's not possible to make everybody happy with these schemes. What we're determined to do is ensure that the benefits for cycling and walking and for road safety outweigh the disbenefits for others. That means trying to mitigate some of the disbenefits for others. and it also means some patience. So we know that a lot of schemes in day one and week one and month one will not be used to full potential. So we know that individuals need to understand and learn how to adjust their travel habits in response to changes to their road networks. And so it takes time, and often it takes more than 6 months for road users to adjust to the changes. And what we want to see in DfT is that the issues are monitored and appropriate changes are made in response to the challenges. Not to immediately hoik them out at the first sign of trouble. They need to be given time to bed in. However, there will be a few schemes where there are challenges. They need to be adjusted pretty quickly, and I think local authorities on the whole have been pretty good at responding to those. I mean, Mark Strong asked a question about what action DfT will be taking on local authorities that have removed schemes from tranche 1. And the answer to that is it depends. So, I mean, if they have been adjusted because there are some serious kind of traffic flow and operational problems, then that is absolutely the right thing to do. If they're being removed because there's some loud dissenting voices, but actually the evidence is starting to show much higher levels of increase in terms of walking and cycling, and good acceptance from residents and businesses, then I think we would question that, and we would want to see what the evidence was behind those removals. However, it's not for DfT to direct local authorities on these issues. I mean, ultimately, highways authorities are responsible for their local roads. They understand their local traffic flows and their local stakeholders, and they're best placed to take these decisions. We in DfT just want to make sure there's a transparent and evidence-based process behind putting them in, taking them out, or amending them. So I'll return to a couple of other questions for DfT a little later, but I now put a few questions to the panel. And I'm going to start off, it's going to be a question for Richard Nickson. So in the chat, so Paula Spinach asks about, sorry, this is a question for Nick, sorry, at Bath and North East Somerset. A question from Paula Spinach here about how many people were surveyed and how are they reached. So it's a question, I guess, about diving down into how we actually undertake some of these surveys. So can you respond on that one first?
So the survey we used was we used SurveyMonkey. We had about 49 questions. We had Leichhardt questions, 5 answers, and also text boxes. We publicized that on various channels through our website and social media, secured about 1,600 responses. And with a huge amount of information on, as well as the graphs I've showed you, huge amount of information in the text boxes. We had about 5 different text box questions, which took a while to analyze. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Yes, it's just a good example of something that all authorities will be seeking to undertake, or already do actually. My second question is actually for Richard Nickson. So this is a question from Harriet Larrington Spencer about how we enforce and manage monitoring and evaluation of schemes to ensure the needs of all road users, but particularly ensuring accessibility for disabled people. So I think, Richard, there were some challenges in one of your local schemes. So can you talk a bit about how you manage those?
Yeah, I mean, we have such a large program of activity. It is a real challenge, and actually I was just listening to Nick's point as well. I mean, one of the key challenges, not just for TFGM but also the districts, is dealing with the sheer volume of plain text responses to any mechanism by which we have. So whether you're using a web portal or whether you're using some kind of questionnaire-based activity, a lot of the information you want to gain on this is qualitative. And so we can't underestimate the challenges that brings in terms of an analysis. Very difficult and very challenging times anyway, because obviously local authorities are under huge amounts of pressure. Specific issues that we've been dealing with on a number of schemes. So, for example, on our Oxford Road corridor, we do have a bus stop bypass, which has caused some concerns for blind and partially sighted pedestrians. So we're pursuing a specific solution to that, which is quite an innovative engineering approach, but we've carried out comprehensive video-based surveys to understand what the dynamic is around that particular piece of infrastructure. And we've got a scheme which will be an experimental scheme for a set of arrangements which alerts, for want of a better word, cyclists to the fact that there's likely to be somebody potentially looking to cross that particular location. So it is about the devil in the detail, I'm afraid. So within our active travel fund bid and also in our broader B network proposals, we have a very, very comprehensive monitoring and evaluation plan put together that's going to involve significant investment in new and improved monitoring, both before and after. I think the other thing that we are looking to do is make the most of all the various other opportunities that are going on to survey people. So I mentioned the clean air plan, bus reform, city centre transport strategy, etc. Exactly like Nick highlighted, they form part of our broader corporate engagement approach. So important to listen to that broad church. And in particular, we're also now looking at a research study, which we're working on closely with the DFT around our potential side road zebra approach, and we're now looking with TRL as to how we can engage vulnerable people, particularly those with either learning difficulties or physical disabilities in this current climate, in researching how those crossings might change. And obviously that brings new challenges because you can't do the traditional face-to-face interviewing techniques that you might have done previously at the moment. So it's about being agile and responding to the challenges that you're presented with.
Thank you, Richard. In fact, you touched on a couple of other issues there, which I think quite a few questioners have asked in the chat, which is how do we go about engaging, considering COVID-19 and some of the social distancing challenges. So I'll just put that on first to Ben Addy for your view.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a challenge, and it's definitely, even more challenging by the fact that, different parts of the country are under different constraints. And I think this is where the digital platforms are really helpful. There is that opportunity to make to have those conversations through those. I would say though that they do exclude some people. You obviously need to be online. You need to be it can be difficult if English isn't your first language. All of those sorts of things. I think it's also about how you ensuring that your communication strategy is just as responsive to this as possible. So, it may be investing in an increased number of things coming through people's door. It may be taking the space, in the neighborhoods, putting up engagement boards in those spaces. It may be about you doing things like temporary trial, like 1-day trials, 2-day trials that gets people talking, that gets people involved. But I do think this is also a really important role for the stakeholder management group that you may form around this, and ensuring that the stakeholder management group is made up of a diverse array of local community leaders and stakeholders, because they have access to a whole pool of people that you just don't. And so if you're feeding them the right information and they are in turn sharing that more widely and ensuring that conversation, as I said earlier, is two-way. I think very often it's all of, I think local authorities quite understandably feel the need to sort of give information, but there's ways of doing that then elicit a response and elicit, a meaningful conversation. And I think, phone banks, mail outs, very visible things in the street, engaging schools, they seem to be, I have a 10-year-old and the communication with my school has gone through the roof in terms of, the different ways they communicate with me as a parent. So making use of those channels that even in lockdown are still functioning.
Okay, great, thanks, Ben. So quite a few things to consider there. I don't know about most people on this call, but I've been pleasantly surprised at just how much consultation and engagement we can do just through digital means, and actually our breadth, our reach has gone a lot further in many ways, as it's a bit more accessible for people in general. However, we do need to consider those that can't access digital means and do need to have, recourse to sort of paper-based surveys or other ways to engage them that don't involve digital means. I'm going to just take another question for DFT. This one was from Tony Waterson asking, how can cash-strapped local authorities manage community engagement? considering the general hollowing out of local authority capacity over the years. So we're being very clear that in the funding that we're providing through tranche 2 of the Active Travel Fund, that funding can be used for consultation and engagement, including documentation and events and activities. We're actually fairly flexible about what is delivered with the funding. So although the bids put forward a sort of set program of work, we know that they get amended and should be amended based on feedback and evidence. And if it's decided that actually there's a couple of schemes there that require more engagement or a bit more contentious, then we're absolutely open to the funding being flexible to cover those, even if it means other issues are not addressed in as much detail, or small parts of programs are amended because there's less funding available. So for those sorts of things, we just ask local authorities to inform us where there has been some substantive change to their projects. From our perspective, we're just really clear that appropriate engagement and consultation does need to happen. So talking about consultation and engagement, there's been a few questions in the chat about what the difference is between consultation and engagement, and when it happens in terms of before, during and after schemes. So I'll put that general question to Ersilia.
Thanks for the question. I'd like to have a slide with a famous, very old paper by Einstein that would have the ladder of different levels of participation. That is quite useful to think about where engagement stands and where consultation stands. I think generally we go from a degree of just informing people what was happening to having participatory design processes in which people can input from each stage. In what would be recommended, and this is a question of resources, as I tried to highlight in my presentation, is that participation should really happen. And I talk about participation because it goes from consultation to engagement, should happen at each stage of the design process, from when we're thinking about what type of intervention till we evaluate after the intervention. But effectively, this cannot be done with few resources. There are different ways of doing it. For example, by identify hard to reach groups by a more quantitative analysis, and then started to engage certain smaller groups that represent more people. But I think there is a lot of debate on participation, and I can point out some references if that's useful.
Great, thanks. So yeah, it'd be helpful. I'm sure, in fact, there's been lots of questions in the chat about sharing the information in terms of the slides and things afterwards, which we will do, and we'll endeavour to follow up with links to various documents and things that have been asked for in the text, where they're publicly available. So turning to another question in the chat, this is a question from Kay Wagland about engagement and consultation being quite resource hungry. How do we go about linking active travel engagements with engagements in other areas? I'm guessing other transport modes or developments. So I'll put that one to Ben at Sustrans.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that's definitely the answer is these things shouldn't be and aren't delivered in isolation. They're not. These schemes aren't. Your average member of the public isn't thinking, oh, this is an active travel fund project and this is another type of transport project. They're just seeing the local authority, the council doing stuff. And I think what's interesting is that meaningful engagement also allows you to tap into any number of other commitments that a local authority might have. It might be about tackling social isolation. It might be amplifying seldom heard voices. It might be including young people in decision making. So you've got this chance, I think, to, yes, you're delivering something, for example, around the Active Travel Fund, but you've got the chance as a local authority to use this to answer to a number of your other commitments. And I think that's exciting. And I think being able to, so often local authorities are sort of accused of delivering stuff in isolation, aren't they? Or you're not thinking about this, or you're delivering this on one hand and now you're doing this on the other. But yes, if you've got multiple street schemes happening in the same area, by pooling your resources around that and showing that this is a joined up holistic approach, I think is really helpful. And yeah, it also benefits from the fact that that allows you to sort of spread your resources a little further.
Great, thank you, Ben. So a bit of a linked question here, which is another good one from Judith Cowie, is asking around how we prime communities for some of the changes that are happening. I know that in Manchester, there's been a long programme of engagement. So Richard, over to you for some tips there.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually just reflecting on what Ben was saying as well, because I think the other thing that we've tried to do is link active travel to the broader health and activity agenda. So, for example, we've got various local pilots which are actually led through our health and social care partnership and on our broad banner called GM Moving, and that's very much actually about that healthy activity that I mentioned, that we're trying to speak holistically to the communities of Greater Manchester about it being a great place to, you know, to grow up, get on and grow old. And I think it's very important to put things in that context. And I think that to some extent links to Ersilia's point about Arnstein's ladder of participation, in the sense that actually on some of these things, particularly say certain transport measures, we know what the community want. They want affordable, accessible transport. And actually what we're trying to engage them with there is about if the solution that we're presenting is answering the right question for what their needs are. So we're not necessarily having a debate with them about, do you want transport or do you want a particular form of transport? We're trying to refine questions around community engagement and ownership on the particular questions. So the one thing I would say is that obviously in the current climate, we have to be very careful about consultation fatigue. Because, you know, as Ben has said, I don't have school-age children anymore, but I can imagine the plethora of communications that are now coming towards parents. And you know, we've got to recognise that to some extent, change has happened to communities this year so dramatically, and many of it has had, you know, there's been no consultation, there's been no question about whether it should happen or not. And we have to be slightly careful, obviously, in that context about overloading communities with questions that to some extent they might look at you and sort of go, well, you've already asked us that. You know, we've already expressed our opinion about the desire to be healthier or the desire to have less traffic. You know, why are you asking us again the same question? And I think it's about trying to take communities through the journey, no pun intended, to what the next parts of that debate are, not constantly reverting back to the base question, if that makes sense. Because I think, as Ersilia was trying to point out, you're moving people up and down that ladder of participation otherwise, and that's going to cause frustration for them because you're not proving any outcome.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. In fact, one of the things you mentioned there was about traffic, and a really good question in the chat from Colin McInnes is around what data we can use to address the widely made claim that traffic and specifically pollution increases around the LTNs in terms of the main roads. So I'm going to put that question to Nick Helps at Bath and North East Somerset. How did you deal with that issue when you were consulting on your schemes?
Yes, that's obviously a difficult issue. It's the one complaint, I think, that people think that traffic will be. I think you may have seen on one of those news articles, the journalist will write, where's the traffic going to go? And so this stimulates the thought that people that live on main roads are going to see more traffic, and are those people on those main roads more socially disadvantaged, and are there more ethnic minorities, for instance, on those streets? And my response would be, we're seeking, I think through livable neighbourhoods will actually be more travel. People will be making more trips, they'll be walking and cycling more. So what's going to happen is we're going to see increasing travel, and our aim will be and less traffic. We will be increasing capacity on the main routes for sustainable travel, walking, cycle, bus, and through the livable neighbourhoods we'll be having increased capacity and convenience and enjoyment for walking and cycling. So with those increases in capacities for sustainable modes, we don't believe that there will be a huge decanting of traffic onto main roads, because the scheme will not have worked if that happens. So that's not the aim.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it takes time. It takes time for traffic to or people to understand how to use their new streets and to convert those journeys. So one of the things that we're always keen to reinforce for ministers when they're engaging with parliamentary colleagues and with the media is that we want to convert as many short journeys as possible to cycling and walking, so that that's less traffic on the road. So there's more road space for others that really need it. Another good question here from Ian Sullivan, which is what role can community groups and local campaigning groups play in speeding up the shift towards acceptability of local traffic neighbourhoods and other cycling and walking schemes? So I'm going to put that one to Ben, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're really important. I think the key is that these things are joined up and that people are working in a coordinated way. But just thinking about where I live, which is in Hackney, in London, we have you know, a number of different community groups, active travel groups, who are really effective at communicating the message around this, that they've, you know, have a lot of members, but they do really practical things during the delivery of well, for London street space schemes. So I don't know, for example, the Hackney Cycling Campaign Group, they do this Bike Buddies scheme where they will, anybody that's new to cycling, for example, can be matched up with a supporter of theirs and help them with, you know, some of their typical journeys to gain confidence. So in those sorts of functions, it's so helpful, it's so useful, and you know, that the more of this that comes from community groups, that comes from communities, the more accepting it will be, and the less likely it is that you're just going to have these kind of very polarized debates and conversation, and that you know, those conversations will then be happening at a local level.
Yeah, thank you. So that's a good one. Obviously, Sustrans are in a unique position in many ways, as both a kind of delivery body, a very kind of trusted stakeholder for government in terms of developing our new scheme, but also with good engagements with the local groups as well. So, and in general, there's some really good stuff on Sustrans' website. I'm surprised Ben hasn't yet publicised yet on top tips for community engagement that are definitely worth looking at. Another good question here from Colin Richardson, talking about sort of advertising and being proactive, I think, in some of the benefits of successful LTN schemes. Do we think it would be a good idea to do this prior to starting new projects? So I'm going to put that question to Richard at TFGM.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should all form part of your travel demand management process. You know, I think too often, you know, we in the profession, we probably think of travel demand management as, you know, have we got the right buses and we've got the right services on, is the ticketing structure correct, and all that sort of stuff. But actually, I think the way in which organisations like ourselves and Transport for the West Midlands and others who are really beginning to push travel demand management into, you know, actually, particularly during COVID, how do we relieve the pressure on the transport network across the whole thing, whether it's no travel at all or whether it's actually use alternative methods. So you probably saw, and we've been renowned for a while for our amusing northern VMS messages across our matrix networks. We've also been postering, we've been leafleting, we've been thanking people under the Safe Streets, Save Lives banner. And I think that's very important. We are also now working up, thankfully, because of the Active Travel Fund, we are working towards, yes, the creation of advertising, hoardings, and those kind of approaches to say something is coming. For us, 2021 will be the year of delivery, for example. So having that broad communications plan in place is really, really important to support what the districts do at the local level. And, you know, whether you're a strategic body or whether you're a unitary authority or a local council, you do need a communications plan. And I think you need the banners, you need the strap lines, you need your social media, because you are trying to communicate a vision for change.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. So I've got a bit of a connected question here. This is for DFT from Ayanda Collins, and she's asking, what is it that DFT actually want between consultation and public opinion surveys? So that's a good question. So we want both. However, they're not the same thing. We know that particular projects can be more contentious, particularly where they involve reallocating road space, taking out parking, putting in point closures. And it's on those sorts of schemes that we would expect there to be higher levels of engagement, perhaps, than putting in a new cycle lane, which doesn't involve having to reduce lanes, or in fact it's done kind of off-road or on a parallel street. However, the public opinion surveys have to be proportionate and appropriately targeted. So later on today, actually, local authorities will be receiving a fairly comprehensive guidance pack on public opinion surveys. We won't be providing lots of evidence on consultation. Local authorities are very familiar with how they engage with their local stakeholders and what the individual needs and priorities are for roads. But we did feel that for public opinion surveys, it's important that people understood perhaps the best way to elicit responses from individuals, and we do want to have a consistent approach across local authorities so that we can start to sort of aggregate views and ensure that we get a bit of a national picture. So that will include some framework questions for authorities and their partners to use when doing public opinion surveys. So these are things that we've already used in the Kantar survey and things we use in wider kind of travel attitude surveys and the like. So there's lots to choose from in there, and they're designed in a way which both informs the respondent without leading the witness. So that resource will be available shortly. So I'm afraid that is the last question that we can cover. I'm afraid it's almost 12 o'clock. So I'm going to call a halt on the questions there. As I say, we will be following up Landor colleagues with the slide pack for this, and we'll endeavour to answer as many other questions offline as we can. So a quick round of thanks to our panel members, to Ersilia, Ben, Richard and Nick, and also to Landor colleagues for putting this on today. So very timely considering where we are with delivering Tranche 2 schemes. So thank you all for attending, and I hope you all have a pleasant afternoon. It's almost the weekend. So thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you.